So considering this model of light, what you see here on the right-hand side is a multi-layered symmetrical model of light. And there are essentially 5 layers of light over here depicted by C with subscript infinity, C, K, Cn, Cu, and C0. And what do these represent? Essentially, this layer at the top represents light in its native state, where light travels infinitely fast. And then subsequent layers represent light projected at slower speeds until they precipitate down to the known speed of 186,000 miles per second, which is represented by this row C to the subscript U. And then also there's a hypothetical row where light projects itself at speed 0. And in this point of view, essentially, it's symmetrical because there's a fourfold reality that exists when light travels infinitely fast. And then we have fourfold realities that exist at each of the subsequent layers of light, which give us a different view of the same reality of light as it exists at that imagined speed where it's projected at either Kn 186,000 miles per second or 0. What you'd also see here are quantization functions. These are depicted by the down arrows and the up arrow over here. And essentially what this quantization function is, it can be thought of as taking subtle information. So there's information that exists when light travels infinitely fast, and then it materializes it into something that's less subtle until it becomes completely physical at this known realm of light traveling at 186,000 miles per second. So that's the broad outline of this model of light. And I'm going to go into this in a little more detail in the subsequent slides. So essentially, here, when we think about this infinite layer where light travels infinitely fast, then what we can say about it is that if we assume a volume or a sphere and we have light at its center, and imagine that you're turning on the source of light. Now, since light travels infinitely fast, it's going to be present everywhere in that volume instantaneously. And therefore, there's a quality of presence that becomes prevalent or that surfaces. Similarly, if there's anything not of the nature of light that arises within that volume, it's going to be overcome by the nature of light, and therefore there's a quality of power. Since everything that appears or disappears is happening in the substance of light, light therefore has a knowledge of what's appearing and disappearing, and therefore there's this property of knowledge that arises. And since everything is occurring in this fabric of light, it's connected by this light, and therefore there's a harmony that exists. And so when we think about light traveling infinitely fast, we have these 4 properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Now, when we think about the information that exists at this layer of light, that information is going to be related to these properties of all presence, all power, all knowledge, and all harmony. And this is simply depicted by the set of presence, power, knowledge, harmony, which have a vast amount of information associated with each of these aspects of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Now, when we go to the next layer, and this is a layer that's occurring now after some initial quantization. And so quantization is taking some subtle information and it's collecting it into a threshold value, which then can materialize itself to a greater degree. and therefore the subtlety becomes less. And what can we expect at this layer? Since this quantization is occurring, therefore we can think of those initial properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony as materializing further or displaying some richness of what each of them stand for. And so this is depicted mathematically as a set of presence. So you can imagine presence being diversified into many, many elements all related to presence. And therefore, the information becomes much more diverse or much more particular. And similarly, there is a set of power, a set of knowledge, and a set of harmony. And so when you depict the information that exists at this layer of reality, then it's simply depicted as four sets, which each have up to infinite elements in them that are all related to the core anchor of that set, which is either presence, power, knowledge, or harmony. Now, when we think of the third layer, similarly, there is a further quantization that's happening. And in that quantization, these elements that exist in these four sets are diversifying further or materializing a different face of themselves. So here simply, what we can think of this information related to is that it's unique functional elements created from the combination of all the elements in these sets of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And mathematically, that's depicted as a function of all the elements of the set PR, the set PO of power, the set knowledge, and the set of harmony. So you have up to infinite number of diverse elements that then become unique functional seeds that display themselves or become apparent at this layer of reality where light is projected at speed n, which is still above our known speed of 186,000 miles per second. So what we see here is therefore three distinct kinds of information that are all, in a sense, genetic type information, because they are specifying certain laws that exist at that particular level of reality. Now, before I get to the layer of CU, I'm going to just focus on this layer where light's projected at zero speed. And we can imagine this layer, which has a reality that's the opposite when light travels infinitely fast. So whereas we had presence, power, knowledge, harmony, here we have the opposite of that. And we can think about that as darkness, weakness, inertia, and chaos. And so the information that exists at this layer has to do with darkness, weakness, inertia, and chaos. So we see very distinct types of information that show themselves at each of these layers of light. And now when we speak about, or when we try and focus on this layer where light travels at 186,000 miles per second, a way to think about this layer is that it is the result of a number of different quantizations that are occurring. And so we have four different quantizations that occur as light projects itself at different speeds, essentially. And this layer here of 186,000 miles per second is the result of a number of these quantization functions. Now, it's depicted as STEG, which actually is space-time energy gravity. And the reason why is because if we think about these infinite number of seeds that exist just in the antecedent layer of light, then in a sense, space becomes an arena for these infinite seeds to materialize and to have the play of whatever is inside these seeds. So space is that arena that allows these seeds to play in a sense. Time becomes a maturity function for these seeds to display the secret of what's inside them. And time can be relative in this point of view because different seeds may mature at different paces. Energy then becomes that property which accompanies each seed and assists in its materialization. So the energy is converted into matter at some point as that maturity is reached. And then gravity can be thought of as a particular kind of coordination between seed and seed or seeds and seeds. And so this is really an aspect of harmony. So what we're seeing here is that just as we had these fourfold realities of presence, power, knowledge, harmony that existed at light traveling infinitely fast and then diversified into the set of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony, therefore displaying another aspect of what presence, power, knowledge, harmony are. So it's the same information, but seen from a different point of view where light's traveling slower. And then at this third layer, where again you're seeing the same information, but diversified into infinite number of seeds, again due to light traveling even slower. But the point is that all these seeds now represent a diversity of archetypes, which is nothing other than knowledge. And therefore, you're seeing that space is, in a sense, a precipitation of light's aspect of knowledge. Similarly, time can be thought of as an inevitability whereby what's inside a seed displays itself, and therefore there's this power due to the inevitability. When we think about energy becoming matter, then we can see that this aspect of energy is a precipitation of light's property of presence. And similarly, when we think about gravity, which holds seeds in a certain kind of collectivity, then we know that gravity is, in this point of view, a precipitation of light's aspect of harmony. And so essentially, we're introduced here to this notion of a persistent quantum level computation that, in fact, determines how these seeds then play out or show the fullness that's contained within them over time. Moving forward, essentially, what we've suggested here is a different view of genetics. And when we think about the information that is essentially being subtilized, that exists at this native speed where light travels infinitely fast and then precipitating into various kinds of information that then show themselves very concretely as this fourfold script of space-time, energy, gravity, then we can think of this precipitation or the source of this precipitation as being the origin of genetics. Now, similarly, when we look at this precipitation, then in a sense, it sheds insight into this light-based downward strand. And we know that then what's occurring or shows itself in time is nothing other than a result of this downward strand. And that gives us insight into this symmetrical upward strand that happens in a reverse way. We also get introduced to the notion of these subtle libraries of pre-genetic information, because we have particular kinds of libraries of information existing at each of these layers of light. And we also get introduced to this notion of a material fabric, just as we have DNA and cells that more concretely show genetic information. The proposal here is that prior to the emergence of cells, there's also this genetic type information, and it's being recorded in what we may call a material fabric that perhaps exists at the quantum veil. And the substance or the script of that material fabric is nothing other than this fourfold space-time energy gravity, which is depicting for each seed how it's going to behave pretty precisely. And so there's this fourfold script that exists not only at layers that precede the DNA in cells, but also I'll make the proposal that the fourfold script that we see within the DNA has some kind of relationship to space-time, energy, and gravity. So what we also see is this notion of a four-base logic encoding ecosystem. And this should be clear from the symmetrical model of light that's all fourfold based from the very layer where light exists natively at its infinite speed, and then subsequently at each layer that shows itself as light projects itself slower and slower. This also introduces us to the notion of superposition in genetics, because what we're seeing is that as something shows itself at the material layer, and particularly in DNA, it has yet its counterpart that exists in superposed form in more subtle layers of light. And this, in this point of view, this becomes the notion of superposition in genetics. Similarly, we have the notion of entanglement in genetics, because when we think about each of these antecedent or more and more subtle layers of light, it's clear that the way that space-time work in any of these subtle layers is very different. For instance, when light's traveling infinitely fast, then everything exists here, everything exists now. So all of reality is present here and now. And therefore, there's automatically an entanglement which everything is subject to. And as things begin to precipitate, that entanglement already has its play. But then there's subsequent entanglements that also occur as light diversifies, as the information in light diversifies into sets and then into seeds. So there's different kinds of entanglement, and these all must have a bearing even on genetics that occurs at the level of the cell. When we think about heredity, then also we can see that in this notion, when we particularly look at this layer of CN, then there's a number of seeds that already exist. So you can think about a seed for a particular species, and then that diversifying into a larger number of very diverse seeds. But the point being that the function is already determined in these seeds, and that's the basis of heredity. When we think about constructive mutation, then it should be apparent from this matrix that when light, or when some particular mechanism that's occurring at 186,000 miles per second integrates with a faster layer of light, that's the basis of a constructive mutation, because that seed that's expressing itself, if it integrates with antecedent layers of light, then some other positive function can also be materialized or influence what's already materialized. And by contrast, when we think about destructive mutation, then it should be apparent that that's due to the influence of this layer where light's projected at zero speed, and where the reality has to do with basically fragmentation, darkness, weakness, inertia, chaos. And so when we think about something going wrong or something degenerating at the level of our genes, we may hypothesize that that's due to some kind of integration with this layer of fragmentation defined by C traveling at, or light traveling at a zero speed. Um, so also there's, in this point of view, a different interpretation of matter, because matter then becomes the output of a persistent quantum level computation that is being arbitrated due to existing reality and a number of influences impinged on it from both antecedent higher layers of light and the layer of light where it's projected at zero speed. From this point of view, finally, we can see that just as there was pre-genetic code that exists perhaps in the material fabric and genetic code, we can also see that due to a persistent quantum level computation, we may reach a reality of post-genetic code, which is some hybridized structure that perhaps has subtle elements also as part of it, as depicted by this light matrix. So essentially what's being pointed to here is a number of areas of further research in genetics. And my only objective with this paper and this presentation was to suggest a different reality or an enhanced way to think about genetics. And if we can think about genetics from this point of view, then also it opens out a lot of avenues for the kinds of research to do with the integration of light and genetics. Incidentally, I did receive a Best Presenter award for this presentation at this conference, and I just wanted to mention that, while I've been giving presentations on cosmology of light and particular applications, this was the first Best Presenter award that I got in this. So this actually occurred 9 to 12 September of this year. And so that was for me a milestone.